Every city runs on systems people don't think about until one of those systems follows them home. You don't think about the bridge until it's on the news. You don't think about the power grid until the lights go out. I've covered both of those, and one of the things that makes them feel distant, even when they're catastrophic, is that you can physically avoid them. You can take a different route. You can wait it out in a different room. There is a geography of escape. Water doesn't work like that. Water is already inside. It's in the pasta you made last night, in the baby's bottle, in the glass you filled without thinking at 11 in the evening. It's the infrastructure you don't perceive as infrastructure at all because it is so completely woven into the domestic fabric of a normal life that its absence or its corruption lands in the most intimate possible place. Flint, Michigan had about 99,000 residents depending on that system in April of 2014. And when that system began to fail them, the thing that made it different from almost every other infrastructure failure I've researched wasn't the contamination. It was what came after. It was the months, nearly 18 of them, during which families stood at their own sinks, watched brown water come out, reported what they were seeing and smelling and feeling in their bodies and their children's bodies, and were told repeatedly by the people whose job was to know, it's safe. You can relax. The water is safe. That is the story of Flint, not just poisoned water, a city that had to prove its own government was poisoning it. Let me take you through how that happened. Flint, in 2014, was a city under a specific kind of administrative pressure. The state of Michigan had appointed an emergency manager to run it, a financial intervention mechanism that effectively suspended normal local government. The city council, the mayor's office, the usual chain of democratic accountability, all of it was operating under the override of emergency management. The task force that later investigated the crisis was pretty direct about what that meant in practice. Emergency managers had replaced local decision-making and removed public accountability. I want you to hold that framing because it matters for everything that follows. The decisions that poisoned Flint were not made in the normal course of local governance, with the normal checks those structures provide. They were made in a cost and control environment where the people living with the consequences had less institutional leverage than usual. That's not incidental to the story. It is the story's first chapter. Flint had long sourced its drinking water from Detroit. That arrangement was not cheap, and while the city awaited a new regional pipeline project that would eventually connect it to Lake Huron, emergency management made a bridging decision, switched to the Flint River as a local water source in the interim. On April 25, 2014, Flint made the switch. Within weeks, people noticed something was wrong. The water looked wrong. It smelled wrong. Residents reported it burned their skin in the shower. They called the city. They called the state. The message that came back was consistent. The water meets federal standards. The water is safe. Then, in August 2014, a boil water advisory went out because of E. coli contamination. A second one followed in September. Then, regulators flagged issues with disinfection byproducts, trihalomethanes, forming in the water as a result of the treatment being applied to control bacteria. The system was telling anyone paying close attention that something was wrong with this water in multiple registers simultaneously. And then, in October 2014, General Motors stopped using Flint water at one of its engine facilities. The stated reason: corrosion. I'll just leave that there for a second. The city was telling residents the water was safe. A car manufacturer, whose business is literally metal, not corroding, decided it wasn't safe enough for engine parts. That's a darkly useful data point. Here is the thing that, when I found it in the task force timeline, I had to read twice. Senior aides to Governor Snyder discussed switching Flint back to Detroit water in October 2014. That is 6 months into the crisis. They looked at the water quality problems and the complaints and apparently reached the conclusion, internally, that this was a real problem. And then the idea was shelved. because of cost concerns, and because the official reassurances kept coming that the water was safe. I've spent time with a lot of internal communications in this kind of research. There is a specific texture to the moment when an institution decides not to act on a problem it has already identified, and instead doubles down on the public reassurance. The Muchmore email, Dennis Muchmore was the governor's chief of staff, captures it. He wrote that Flint residents were being, and I'll paraphrase here, blown off, that the state was not taking their concerns seriously. He wrote that in July 2015. The reassurance continued anyway. While all of this was happening at the institutional level, something else was happening at the residential level that I think is one of the most important threads in this entire story. Leanne Walters lived in Flint. She had children. She started noticing what the water was doing to her family. Rashes, hair loss, her kids getting sick. She called the city. She called the state. She got the same answers everyone else was getting. So she started collecting her own evidence. She connected with Miguel del Toral, an EPA water expert who had already identified, through his own professional channels, that Flint had no corrosion control treatment in place. None. That is the mechanism that matters here technically, so let me explain it once. When water sits in pipes, especially old pipes that may contain lead, a properly treated water supply will deposit a thin protective coating on the inside of those pipes that prevents lead from leaching into the water. Corrosion control is not a luxury feature. It is the barrier between the pipe's chemistry and what comes out of your tap. Flint River water was significantly more corrosive than Detroit water, and it was running through those pipes with no corrosion control treatment. The coating was not only absent, the corrosive water was actively stripping what protective deposits already existed. Del Toral knew this. He documented it. He raised it with his agency. He also helped Walters arrange independent testing at her home. The results from 3 city tests at Walters' address came back at 104, 397, and 707 parts per billion. The EPA action level for lead is 15 parts per billion. Independent testing, backed by Virginia Tech, found an average of 2,500 parts per billion at her home, with a high of 13,200. These are not close calls. These are numbers that should have produced immediate categorical action. The state's public response from Brad Werfel, the MDEQ spokesman, was that worried residents could relax. I want to be precise about something. I don't think Brad Werfel invented that framing on his own. I think he was delivering the institutional conclusion his agency had reached, which was that the residents were wrong and the official readings were right, and the job was to manage the communication, not the crisis. That is not a rogue communications officer problem. That is an imposture problem. And the task force report, which I'd recommend reading if you have a high tolerance for bureaucratic language concealing real anger, is fairly damning about which agencies bear the most responsibility for that posture. Mark Edwards and the Virginia Tech team provided the external scientific validation that turned Leanne Walters' documentation from a single household's evidence into a citywide data set. They tested homes across Flint. The picture was consistent. The water was not safe. And then came the finding that made denial morally untenable. Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha was a pediatrician at a Flint hospital. She had been watching the city's situation with growing alarm, and she decided to look at something very specific. Blood, lead levels in Flint children before and after the water switch. There is no safe level of lead exposure in children. That is not a contested statement. Lead at any detectable level in a developing nervous system is a harm. It affects learning, attention, behavior, and development. The question Hana Atisha was asking was, is there evidence this switch hurt children? Her data showed that the percentage of Flint children under 5 with elevated blood lead levels had risen from 2.4% to 4.9% after the water source change. The increase was largest in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. She held a press conference on September 24, 2015. Werfel's response described the concerns as, and I'm quoting his framing, near hysteria, a pediatrician presenting blood data about children, and the state's public response was near hysteria, I've covered a few different versions of this dynamic, the moment when the evidence becomes undeniable, and an institution's response is to attack the credibility of the person presenting it rather than engage with what they found. I looked at this pattern in my video about the I-35 West Bridge, where the people who flagged the structural concerns got routed into a bureaucratic process that eventually went nowhere. It's a recognizable move. The evidence arrives, the institution reframes the messenger. In Flint's case, it did not work. The blood data was real, it was public, and it was attached to children's names. The wall held for about 3 more weeks. On October 16, 2015, Flint was reconnected to Detroit water. Let me be clear about what that date means in context. It is not the end of the crisis. It is the moment the crisis was officially admitted. The pipes had been running corrosive water without corrosion control for 18 months. The damage to the pipe infrastructure and the lead that had already moved into homes, into water, into children, did not reverse when the source switched. The contamination window that CDC identified runs from April 25, 2014 to October 15, 2015. 99,000 people. Snyder declared a state of emergency for Genesee County in January of 2016. Obama approved a federal emergency declaration 11 days later. The bottled water distribution lines that became one of the defining images of this story appeared. And then, as tends to happen in these cases, the machinery of political accountability started turning at the rate political accountability machines turn, which is to say, slowly, partially, and with significant disagreement about where exactly the responsibility stopped. Snyder testified before Congress and described Flint as a failure of government at all levels. That framing has always struck me as worth examining. It is accurate. There were federal failures, state failures, city failures, regulatory failures. But there is a version of everyone failed that does a specific kind of work. It distributes responsibility so broadly that the causal chain connecting particular decisions to particular harms becomes harder to follow. The task force report does not actually support the everyone equally framing. It places primary accountability on the state, and most specifically on MDEQ. That is a more precise finding, and precision is what you need if you want the finding to be actionable. One thread I want to pull on before we close, because it tends to get less attention than the lead contamination: the Legionnaire's disease outbreak. Between June 2014 and November 2015, Genesee County experienced a significant spike in Legionellosis cases, 87 confirmed, 10 deaths. The task force concluded that the Flint River management may have contributed to the conditions that allowed the bacteria to spread through the water system. That causation remained technically unresolved at the time of the report. I find the ambiguity itself worth naming. The outbreak happened in the same water system, in the same window, under the same conditions. The investigation said it may have been connected but could not definitively confirm it. That is the kind of finding that gets filed away when the main story is moving fast enough. 10 deaths attached to a question mark in a task force appendix. I think about that. There is also this. CDC ran a community health assessment in Flint in 2016 that found 66% of households reported at least one adult with worsened behavioral health issues. 54% reported the same for at least one child. The crisis was not only chemical, it was psychological. It was the experience of learning over 18 months that you could not trust the information coming from the systems that are supposed to protect you. That damage does not show up in a lead level. It shows up in the follow-up years, in the way people interact with public services, in what they teach their children to assume about official reassurance. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission, which also examined the crisis, said directly that race and systemic racism could not be separated from the story of why Flint's complaints were easier to dismiss. Flint was a majority black city. It was a financially distressed city. It was a city under emergency management that had removed the normal political channels through which residents push back on the people making decisions about their lives. That combination, demographic, economic, administrative, shaped the environment in which warnings got blown off and scientists got dismissed as hysterical. I'm not going to pretend that's separate from the rest of the story, because the task force didn't pretend that either. The EPA terminated its Flint emergency order in 2025, more than a decade after the switch. That is how long the administrative aftermath ran. Whether compliance equals recovery is a question I'd put to anyone who lived through it. Here is what I think Flint actually teaches, and I'm going to be direct about it. When a public water system teaches 99,000 people that official reassurance is less reliable than the brown water coming out of their tap, you have not only poisoned a city, you have done something to the fabric of what it means to live in a city, the basic operating assumption that the system is, at minimum, not actively lying to you about the thing you depend on to survive. That assumption is not easily rebuilt. It is not rebuilt by compliance timelines or emergency order terminations or settlement announcements. It is rebuilt, if it is rebuilt at all, by a long accumulation of evidence that the institutions actually changed, not the pipes, but the behavior. And that is the slower repair, the one that doesn't make the news. I keep coming back to the detail about the 45,000 index cards. That is reportedly the format in which Flint's service line records were stored when the crisis hit. Who had lead lines, who had copper, where the pipes ran. 45,000 physical index cards in a city that needed urgently to know which homes were at highest risk. That is not just a database problem. It is a picture of how much deferred investment in basic administrative infrastructure had accumulated before the water even changed. The visible crisis sat on top of an invisible one. If you want to understand the full mechanism of how Flint happened, I'd point you to 3 places. The Flint Water Advisory Task Force final report, which is publicly available and is one of the more honest government self-examinations I've read on a case like this. Leanne Walters' congressional testimony, which I think is more important primary source material than most of the commentary written about her. And Mona Hanna-Attisha's work, both her published study and her congressional testimony, which tells you exactly how a scientist behaves when institutional pressure is pushing back against data she is confident in. Those 3 things, in that order, will give you a better picture of what happened than most summaries of it, including this one. Flint was not a hidden failure. It was a denied one, and those are not the same thing. If this video was useful to you, if it gave you something to think about or something to look up, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and leave a comment. I'm genuinely curious. When you think about the infrastructure you depend on most directly, the water, the power, the transit, the things you use before you've had your first cup of coffee, how much do you actually trust the systems managing it? Not in theory, in practice. Tell me where you land on that, because I think the honest answers would be interesting, and I'd like to read them.